Welcome to Transformational Psychology. I'm Ryan Holsapple. Today we're going to talk about the main differences between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. So let's get started. Sigmund Freud developed the idea of the sexual libido, the sexual energy. The libido is that energy, mainly sexual, runs throughout your entire psychic system, some of which we can repress. And this was so important to Freud's idea of psychology, this psychosexual basis. And you can see it throughout his entire developmental theory. As children go through different stages of developments, they are really wrestling with their sexuality in one way or another. So Freud really believed the sexual energy to be the core component to psychic life. Now, to be fair and complete with Freud, he also took very seriously the idea that there were other instincts other than just the sexual urge. For example, he believed that there was an ego instinct. There was an inborn drive to attempt to develop an ego. It wasn't fully formed, but you had the roots and the seeds of the capacity for ego, which could develop into more of a full-fleshed instinct. And to Freud, ego just simply meant the mediator, the manager, right? So you have the superego, which is the societal pressures, the shoulds, the should nots, the moral obligations, the need to fit in within a larger social structure, the judgments, the shames, the acceptance that comes from outside. And then you had the ego, which is the mediator. And then you had the id, which were the base instincts. And the ego's job was to try to make a compromise between the superego and the id. And in order to do that, you have to understand the drives that you want to release, right? Because for Freud, everything's about releasing drives. It's about finding an object to release drives onto. It's not so much about the object itself, it's about the ability to seek the pleasure and release the drive and discharge. And so the ego has to find a way to do this if it is developed and integrated well, that is acceptable and mature and capable of resolving its own identity with the environment. However, oftentimes there are developmental issues, whether they're in childhood or throughout relationships, where you repress certain drives, or you have experiences that lead you to repress certain drives. And if they're repressed to the extent that you're totally unconscious of them, then that can create neurosis. So neurosis is when the symptoms of psychic repression, where you attempt, I'll give you an example. I feel, from a Freudian perspective, you would say, well, I feel this sexual urge. It's not okay to have this urge. I don't know how to deal with it in my egoic state of mind. I don't know how to integrate it. There's no place for it to go. I'm freaking out. So I'm going to push it down. And the problem with doing that is it comes back with a vengeance. Anything that you repress will come up as symptoms from a Freudian perspective. So to Freud, when he was working with clients in psychoanalysis, he's looking at their neurosis and what he called hysteria, and he's tracing it back. Oh, there must be some drives that you have repressed into your unconscious that make you act and feel the way that you are. Now, there's problems with this way of thinking that have been critiqued, and there's also strengths to it. One of the problems to this way of thinking is that, first of all, when you create a word like the unconscious, what happens is you throw falsifiability out the window. You can't test it. It's in the unconscious. It's unknowable. So you can say, my client over here has an unconscious desire to sleep with his mother, and he's repressed that desire because it's so uncomfortable. And then when I bring it up, he gets angry at me because he has a defense mechanism and doesn't want to admit that he wants to sleep with his mother. Do you see how you can now weave a story to corroborate your claim? And it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's just the story that you've built on a unquestionable, untestable premise. You can't search its validity. So that's a problem. Now, there are also very salient aspects to this. For example, the idea that we get uncomfortable and we push things away. I wouldn't call it repression. I prefer the term suppression, because it's more proactive and we take more personal responsibility that we indeed made a choice at some point to push something out. It wasn't just done to us. We consciously felt something and we didn't like it, so we tried to push it away. So I like the idea of choice rather than everything being unconscious. So suppression will happen, and I think that's a very salient and important idea that comes out of this type of thinking, and I think Freud was brilliant in pointing this out. But let's get back to the main point here. What are the differences? So Jung didn't like this idea of the sexual libido being the core component to psychic life. He didn't believe it was as basic and pervasive as Freud did. So he went on in Symbols of Transformation, and he published this work, and Freud didn't like it because what he said was, listen, libido isn't just sexual. Libido is life energy. It's psychological energy. And psychological energy can apply to anything. It can apply to our basic instincts, to drink water, to eat, to have shelter, including sex. But it also goes deeper than that, because to Jung, you see, the libido reaches into the archetypal. And what that means is that we're primarily historical creatures. So we're one little human being standing on a vast sea called the collective unconscious, which you can view as a phylogenetic, meaning a species-wide shared web, shared matrix of inherited history, and you could call it instinct, you could call it image, you could call it pattern. But there's something deeper than just the sexual urge and the death drive that Freud also talked about. There's something deeper and almost more complicated, not almost, definitely more complicated in that unconscious system. To the Freudian unconscious isn't as rich and developed as the Jungian unconscious. The Freudian unconscious says, well, you have these basic drives, you've got the id, then you inherit these drives. You have a sex drive and a death drive, an aggressive drive and a sexual drive. That's it. And your psychological life is based on how you integrate, repress, or deal with the libidinal and aggressive energy inside of you. And if you repress things, then it goes into the unconscious and creates dream content. It creates neurosis. It creates all sorts of issues. So, but that's all developmental through life experience. Something happens, or you have a developmental failure, or something happens in your environment, and you don't sequence through the proper stages, and then there's a failure, and that failure results in a neurosis or a hysteria or whatever. So it's all based on this idea of repression. Now, to Jung, it's much more complicated than that. To Jung, he's saying, no. It's not just we're repressing these basic things and then that's what's coming up from the unconscious. No, the unconscious is much bigger and more powerful than that. The unconscious is full of these archetypal representations, and they have a life of their own. They have their own autonomy. So obviously this archetypal content is much more than what you would see in a basic Freudian conception of instinct. We've got the archetypes of the warrior, the mage, the athlete, the hermit. There's all these different forces, figures, and energies that get represented by images that are sitting in that collective sphere from Jung's perspective. And these are actually much more powerful than the human consciousness that is living an individual life. In fact, to Jung, we are lived by the archetypes rather than having ownership over them. It's almost as if we are animated by forces that we do not understand. There's all these things that are a part of our human history that Jung believes are hanging out down there. And the libidinal energy is the life energy, the force that's animating these images, the life force, I guess you could call it. And so that's a really important point to make, because you can see how Jung is really broadening the definition of humanity's psyche here, whereas Freud narrows it down to something really limited and specific, and also valuable in a lot of ways, as I mentioned, because the idea of not being able to handle certain emotions or content and then pushing them down, or having the maturity to sublimate and integrate, that's a really important contribution. Now, Jung's contribution is really important too, because it shows the dynamic range of being human. Now, there's problems with what Jung says too. Again, their use of the word unconscious is very hard to validate. Jung even admitted this to himself. He said, there is no hope that any theory on the unconscious will ever be scientifically validated, because it is unconscious and cannot be explored or tested, or there cannot be any ability to illuminate the validity of claims that are put forth. And so there are issues in that. And today, what neuroscientists, some neuroscientists are still using, and psychologists are still using the word unconscious today, but it's a little bit different. Basically, we understand it more from a brain perspective. I'll give you an example. A couple months ago, I was thinking about going to the gym. I really wanted to go to the gym, but I had dinner obligations with my lovely woman at home, and so the part of me that wanted to go to the gym was at war with the part of me that had partnership responsibilities and bonding with her. So she asked me can you run to the store and grab some almond flour or something like that? And I said, sure. So I get in the car and I start driving to the store, and I wasn't paying attention, and I pulled up to the gym. So there's an understanding of what they mean by unconscious today. It's an automatic programming that the brain held on to, and the part of my mind that is consciously aware wasn't paying attention, and my brain drove me straight to the gym. And then I get in the parking lot. I said, oh my God, I'm thinking about going to the gym all day. My brain thinks, don't listen to her. We're going straight to the gym. That's what we're really being told to do. So that's a example of how being automatic or unconscious can be claimed today, but it's a little different than what they were claiming back in the 18 and 1900s. So, okay, I hope that was helpful. I hope that this gives you a basic idea of the differences between Freud and Jung. Again, libidinal energy, sexual or bigger. That's really how to think of it. Freud wasn't just saying sex is all there is, period, because he acknowledged the death drive, he acknowledged the ego instinct, he acknowledged different things that show that he was open to the possibility that there's more. The problem is he couldn't get on board with Jung's radical shifting of his idea, and they couldn't work together anymore for that and various other reasons. So that's what I have for you today. I hope that was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed this analysis video. I have a podcast. It's called Transformational Psychology with Ryan Holsapple. It's on this YouTube channel. It's in a playlist I'll leave for you here in the description and on the page, as well as I'll continue to do analysis videos such as this, and I hope that you have a wonderful day or evening, depending on when it is and where you are. Welcome to Transformational Psychology. My name is Ryan Holsapple. I created this podcast because I believe that human beings have the capacity to transform and live deeply meaningful lives. My podcast is based on two pillars: education and transformation. The educational branch allows us to explore the cutting-edge psychology of transformation and many important theoretical ideas. Monologues, interviews with experts, and transformational concepts are presented for the audience to engage with and reflect on. I also believe it is of the utmost importance that people have practical transformational tools for making real-life changes. So this podcast still provides applicable and digestible guidance to complement the theoretical component. It is my hope that this podcast offers education and transformational guidance to a world that is seeking meaning and connection.